After the success of the first series of Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends, it was a given that there would be even more Railway series stories that would be ripe for adaptation on the television, and that's exactly what happened. Series 2 of Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends first aired in the September of 1986, 2 years after the debut of Series 1. Was it any good? Well, yes, it was. If it wasn't, then we probably wouldn't have gotten Series 3, 4 and 5 and everything else afterwards. Is it perfect though? Well, that's what this video is going to be about. So please sit back, grab a nice hot cup of tea, and get ready to shave your eyebrows off, because it's time to talk about Series 2. By the way, if you haven't subscribed yet, then please do so. I am so close to 4,000 subs, and that would be a great confidence boost and really help the channel, so please consider doing that. Series 2, along with Series 1 before it, is by far the most nostalgic era of Thomas and Friends for me. I was born in 1995, between the releases of Series 4 and 5, and at this point the era in which I consider the classics was coming to an end. Everything after Thomas and the Magic Railroad is basically non-existent to me, and my life began around the time the franchise was reaching its peak, I think. As a kid, most of my Thomas viewing experiences came from the various VHS tapes I had, which contained episodes from every series up to 4. While I remember them all fondly, for some reason the Series 2 episodes were the one that stuck with me the longest, wedged into my brain as the definitive display of childhood Thomas. I can't explain why, it just is. For the longest time I considered Series 2 to be my favourite of all the 5 series, but after rewatching it all for this review and thinking about it a bit more, I do have some stronger thoughts that go both ways. Do I still think it's the best? Well, let's just wait and see. I think the main theme of Series 2 overall is change. Many of the stories deal with changes to the railways and how the characters react to them. Series 1 was very much a show about the railway frozen in time, with a fully steam engine cast that only very lightly touched on things like roads creeping in to take over. By the time of Series 2, everything is changing. Sodor is being dragged towards the future, whether the characters like it or not. Edward is getting on in years, and other characters frequently bring this up. By this point in time, there are newer, bigger and more powerful engines around, which could render him obsolete. It's a very real and relatable struggle, and Edward proves more than once that despite being outdated, he can still prove his worth when the situation calls for him. There is still a place for old iron like him. He even meets a fellow old machine who is destined for the scrap heap because there's no perceived use for him, and manages to get him rescued. This comes in the form of Trevor, who Thomas meets as well, and he is a bit baffled by him, but he does come to understand how useful he is. In Series 1, Rail met Road, as Thomas had his race with Bertie, and now in Series 2, Rail meets Air, when Percy has his race with Harold. We've seen how railways have to compete with the roads, and now we have to see how they may also have to compete with air travel. Railways won't be the dominant method of travel forever, and we are seeing that. Diesels arrive on the railway for the first time, and this is a major shift. Up until now, it's just been steam engines doing their thing, but, as is in the real world, time and technology march on, and the new era of rail begins to creep into Sodor. Not everybody is too accepting of these newfangled engines when they start arriving. The first of them, the aptly named Diesel, claims to be revolutionary, and most of the other engines are very taken by your first impressions. Duck isn't too enthusiastic about it, and he does not put up with Diesel's boasting, then humbles him. He gets kicked off the railway, only to inexplicably get invited back for the Christmas party and then come back in Series 3. Not really sure what happened there. Next is Daisy, who acts like a total cow when she first shows up, refusing to do certain tasks and not getting along well with the others. However, she does learn to work with them. She proves that despite having a rocky start, she's able to get better and becomes friends with them. Lastly, and I think most importantly, is Boko. We aren't introduced to him straight away, and I think this is a really effective method of doing it. Bill and Ben learn a Diesel is in the yard, and they are downright spooked, thinking that the Diesel is stealing their trucks and will magic them away. After Edward clears things up, Bill and Ben learn that Boko is actually really nice and they get along. These 3 separate occurrences of a new Diesel play an important role and teach an important lesson to the kids about first impressions. We're given 3 different scenarios of somebody new arriving and interacting with people, and the first impression that they leave. In this first scenario, the newcomer manages to impress most of the characters, but one of them is doubtful. After a series of events, those doubts are proven right, as the newcomer is actually horrible and then sent away as a result. This shows that sometimes your first impression can actually be right, and people will actually be as bad as you think they are. In scenario 2, the newcomer acts stuck up and rude to others, and nobody likes them. They have a horrible first impression that endears them to absolutely nobody, and they don't even try to fit in. They're lazy and insulting. However, Toby is willing to give them a chance, and tells the Fat Controller that they did work hard after Percy's accident, and he is willing to teach them how to work better. This shows that sometimes a first impression may not be great, but with a bit of time and effort that can change for the better. In scenario 3, our first impression of the Diesel isn't even seen through our own eyes. What we first learn of the Diesel is through Bill and Ben, who think that it's some malicious or scary new engine that steals trucks and will zap them away. Throughout all of this, the Diesel isn't even present on screen, so we can't even get this impression of ourselves. However, when we do meet Boko, we do see that it was all a misunderstanding. This shows that sometimes your first impression of somebody can be completely wrong, and that you shouldn't automatically jump to conclusions before you really meet somebody. Through these 3 different scenarios, the audience gets to learn that meeting new people can go in completely different directions, no matter what your first impressions are, which is a good lesson to learn for life. I'm sure we can all relate to that. Sometimes we meet people who really aren't what they seem at first. This lesson works especially well with diesels, because to the steam engines, they are so new and different. They haven't interacted with anyone like this before, engines that are nothing like them in terms of outward appearance and build. They're basically foreigners to them, and having some friction that leads to different outcomes that are ultimately more positive is a good analogy. It's impressive that all of this was taught to kids so subtly and naturally that I'm convinced it may not even be intentional. Or maybe it was and it just flew over my head for years. Either way, I think it's really well done. For the first time, the show has actual bona fide villains to deal with. In Series 1, certain characters antagonised each other, but they were never actually villainous, more just like co-workers or even family getting even with each other. And then, they were alright with each other not too long after. I guess the irritable policeman could count, but he was just a guy doing his job, even if he was a bit of a knob. Diesel actively tries to turn everyone against Duck, and succeeds in getting him sent elsewhere for a while. He wasn't just messing around, he really did want to hurt Duck. Then there's the spiteful brake van, who tried to make Douglas's life a misery whenever he had to take him out somewhere. Having actual villains in the show is a great idea, because it gives the audience someone to root against and genuinely detest. And it also fleshes out the world a bit more by showing that not everyone is a good guy. Sometimes people are just horrible. Not only do the characters go through changes, but the railway does too. A new harbour is being built during the event of Thomas and Trevor, and is then finished and in use by the time of Percy and Harold. The viaduct that we've seen plenty of times before is also undergoing repairs, and these are seen across 3 episodes, being a major plot point in one. This all helps portray a good passage of time throughout the series. Sodor is evolving. Series 2 has a bit of a different flow of stories to how Series 1 did it. What I mean by that is, in Series 1, the episodes were more organised into major arcs for characters that introduced them and then showed how they develop. Here's a rundown of the first series so you know what I mean. Thomas and Gordon, Thomas's train, Thomas and the trucks, and then Thomas and the breakdown train establish the main protagonist of the show, and how he's a cheeky little bugger that plays with fire and thinks he's up to any job. But then he gets humbled and actually gets his chance to really work hard and shine, and in doing so, gets rewarded with the branch line that he'll spend the rest of the episodes working on. Somewhere in between all of that, Henry gets blocked up in this tunnel in the sad story of Henry, and then that is followed directly by getting let out in Edward Gordon and Henry. Following James's accident on his first day in Thomas and the breakdown train, James has a series of events that spans across 3 episodes. After that are 4 episodes that show just what Thomas is getting up to on his new branch line that he earned previously. When Terence arrives to help Thomas and Terence, we see Bertie show up to take the passengers, and then in the next episode, we're introduced to Bertie properly, who references all of that just happened. Tenders and turntables shows how the bigger engines react to Thomas going off on his branch line, and then this directly leads into trouble in the shed, when they decide to go on strike and Percy is brought in. This is followed up in Percy Runs Away, which has the big engines being miserable when they're shut in the sheds, while Percy goes around doing all the work. Toby and the Stout Gentleman establishes Toby on his own line, which is in the process of closing down, and it ends with the tease of the Fat Controller bringing him to his railway. In Thomas in Trouble, we found out why this happened, and we do get to see Toby helping out Thomas. Dirty Objects then follows up on Toby's introduction to the railway, where he gets to know more of the characters, and that he isn't one to make fun of. Off the Rails has Gordon fall in a ditch, and which down the mine then references by Thomas joking about it. But then he gets his comeuppance when he falls down the mine, and both of them are in disgrace and find common ground in it as they become allies. So, of the 26 episodes of Series 1, only 3 of them weren't really part of some overarching plot arc, those being Edward and Gordon, Cole, and Thomas's Christmas party. You could make a case for 3 of the stories in Thomas's branch line not being part of something either, but I think they do work as just a bunch of stories showing what happens on the branch line that he just earned. Hopefully I didn't lose you there by talking too much about Series 1, but I just wanted to show how it had a very tight and connected number of episodes. In comparison, Series 2 comes across as a bit more episodic, I suppose. Some of the episodes are still connected and there is still continuity, but the ones here seem a bit more like cherry-picked stories of things that happened to happen on the railway this year. It starts with Thomas, Percy and the Cole, and then right after that is Cows, and then Bertie's Chase. None of these really have anything to do with each other. Save from Scrap, Old Iron, and then Thomas and Trevor, could be considered a trilogy, as Edward meets a fellow old engine who is deemed out of date, and then helps prove that he's still worth keeping. And then he has to prove that he himself is useful too. In Thomas and Trevor, we see how Trevor's been doing since he was saved from Scrap, and work begins on the new harbour. Percy and the Signal is next, which is then referenced in Duck Takes Charge, as Percy thinks back to his annoyance. The Fat Controller asks Percy if he wants to go help out at the harbour, that was started back in Thomas and Trevor. Duck is introduced in Duck Takes Charge, but he doesn't have anything to do until the runaway, which is the episode after the next one. Percy and Harold happens next, and we see that Percy is still working at the harbour. Then comes Percy Takes the Plunge, which references things that we haven't even seen yet. It's a whole thing I'll talk about later, don't worry. Pop Goes the Diesel introduces Diesel, who does not get along well with Duck, and then this leads into Dirty Work, where Diesel gets his revenge and makes other engines turn on Duck. This culminates in A Close Shave, where Duck gets the return after a crash, and Diesel was discovered to have been acting like a prat off screen and kicked out. After the Duck stories is Better Late Than Never, which is just kind of its own thing, and then we get Brake Van. This introduces Donald and Douglas, which ends on a bit of a cliffhanger that then gets resolved in the next episode, The Deputation. Thomas Comes to Breakfast starts a trilogy of episodes that have him sent away to be mended, resulting in Daisy being introduced, and then learning to get on with others and work harder, and then Thomas comes back at the end. The next 3 episodes, The Diseasel, Wrong Road, and Edward's Exploit, are all adapted in order from the same book, although Series 3's Buzz Buzz was in between The Diseasel and Wrong Road. These introduce Bill and Ben and show how they like winding up the other engines. They also introduce Boko, who has a part in each of them. Finally, there's Ghost Train, which is then directly referenced in Woolly Bear, and feels like a cap to a trilogy of episodes about Thomas and Percy making fun of each other, although the first episode of that trilogy was the very first episode of the series. It's a bit too spread out, I think. Capping off this series is Thomas and the Missing Christmas Tree, an episode which could honestly take place anywhere after Diesel shows up, to be honest, but before he gets sent away, because was he just invited back for the party, or what? So you can see that there is some continuity between all of these, but it just seems less connected than Series 1 was. Unfortunately, Series 2 does have its fair share of oddities and inconsistencies that came as a result of not adapting certain stories in order. Percy Takes the Plunge references the events of Percy's Promise, which in the books happened a good while before. Percy's Promise was planned to be adapted into an episode of Series 2, but it was cancelled, later being adapted into Series 3. The story and dialogue of Percy's story in Percy Takes the Plunge was left intact, which creates a bit of a head-scratcher, since he's now referencing events which haven't actually happened yet on screen. Infamously, one story named The Missing Coach was meant to be adapted, which would have fleshed out the introduction of Donald and Douglas a bit more, and then lead into the events of Brake Van. Unfortunately, the adaptation was cancelled, and the introduction of the twins was crammed into the opening narration of Brake Van. They're just here one day and that's it. Bill and Ben get introduced immediately too, but it's not implied that they're new, it's like they've been there for a bit, and this is just the first we're seeing them. The first time we see them, they aren't even introduced. They're just kind of there. Diesel's feud with Duck spanned 3 episodes, adapted from the book Duck and the Diesel Engine. One of that book's stories was Domeless Engines, which wouldn't be adapted until Series 3, as Gordon and the Famous Visitor. In that story, Duck meets a fellow Great Western engine who really inspires him, and they have a great time chatting. The visit made Duck so proud that he talks endlessly about it to the other engines, and he makes the place run like clockwork, and they get sick of it. This then leads to the events of Pop Goes the Diesel, where he's going around acting all that and everyone else is sick of it. And that's why they're so happy when Diesel shows up. Since Domeless Engines wasn't included here, it means Duck is just going around talking about the Great Western Way just because he wants to.
Don't we know it?
Now, I know not everything has to be a perfect adaptation of the books. I'm not a purist who needs slavish accuracy to source material. I know there's a budget and model constraints that mean decisions need to be made for the sake of finishing the show with what they have. I even think that making more changes to some of the original stories could have benefited the show. Having the resolution to Duck and Diesel's feud be to send Diesel away off screen was a terrible decision. That feels like such a letdown. I would have loved to have actually seen Diesel getting his comeuppance and personally sent away by the Fag controller on screen. That would have been so cathartic. I would have also changed the runaway a bit to not feel like a mishmash of two different stories. Series 2 very much feels like more of a, here's what happened this year on Sodor, than Series 1 did. What I mean by that is, things feel more spread out and varied, with less time spent introducing the characters, so we can just jump straight into seeing all sorts of things happening that aren't necessarily connected as much. It's less concerned with introducing people and more just showing things that happen, which is fine I suppose. We did get the first spooky episode of Thomas and Friends here, in the episode Ghost Train. This sparked a bit of a tradition, which would see further series have their own spooky episodes. Now Thomas and Friends is, for the most part, quite grounded and down to earth. When you accept the fact that these are engines that have faces and can talk, they're just stories about things that happen in the day-to-day life of a working railway. Most of the things that happen are quite mundane. A story involving supernatural events and otherworldly occurrences would surely be in direct opposition to that, which is why I think it was a great idea to have the ghost not really be a ghost, but just Percy in disguise. That way you can run wild with all the spooky imagery you want, but still keep it grounded and believable, and they certainly succeeded here. The way the crew uses lighting and environmental effects to create such an effectively spooky atmosphere in this episode is downright spectacular, taking sets we've already seen in the daytime, like the station yard and the watermill, and making them scary. If I had to pick my favourite episodes, it would have to be Percy Takes the Plunge, Ghost Train, and The Deputation. I love Percy Takes the Plunge because of how in continuity it is with other stories, even if it's in a bit of a weird spot, which again I'll talk about soon. The music is great, and I love the harbour set in both the day and the night. Ghost Train is awesome because I really enjoy spooky stories and I think the sets look really good. And finally The Deputation, because I love the way the engines all come together to defend Donald and Douglas. They may all bicker from time to time, but when it really matters, they do come together like a close-knit family. It's awesome seeing them all come to Donald Douglas's aid like that. My least favourite episode is The Runaway. Now, the first minute and a half or so of the episode is actually great. Thomas getting ill and needing to go away while Stuck looks after Annie and Clarabelle is a nice idea, and I think that could have honestly been the basis for a whole episode itself. You could have had Thomas learning how to not be jealous about somebody else using his carriages, and maybe even highlight the tension between the two characters. Come to think of it, I don't think Thomas and Duck even interact at all in this series. But after that, Thomas comes straight back, and it's like a whole different story, with Thomas having his runaway sequence due to his brakes being a bit weird. This would have been a fine standalone story too, with a long epic runaway scene to rival A Close Shave, but instead it's just kind of boring because most of it is spent just showing Harold flying. There's not really much cohesion between these two halves of the episode, and it feels a bit janky with missed potential. We do get a really good new build up to the runaway theme though. This episode is based on a story from a book Christopher Audrey wrote specifically to adapt into episodes, and I think it shows. Easily my least favourite episode. Now it's time for something potentially controversial. Edward's exploit is considered by many to be an amazing story. I don't think it's that great of an episode. Don't get me wrong, I think the story itself is great. It's an awesome display of Edward's determination to push through not only bad weather, but a potentially catastrophic injury. But I don't think it should have been in Series 2. To start with, we've already had an episode of Edward proving that he can still work perfectly well despite his issues, back in Old Iron. Not only that, but it feels kind of redundant having James learn a lesson about disrespecting Edward after he gets saved, back in Old Iron, and then he goes back to making fun of him here, in Edward's exploit.
Positively painful, remarked James.
On a technical, more production point of view, I don't think it works that well either. The whole point of the story is that Edward is able to continue working despite the bad weather and his injury, right? Well, where's the bad weather? The sky seems a bit greyer and we hear the sound of a storm, but we don't really see anything else. It just looks like he's travelling through perfectly normal conditions. When he suffers his injury, there's no visible damage. He looks completely fine other than his facial expression. In my own, humble, ultimately useless opinion, this episode should have been saved for a later series, where the production team could have used more convincing weather effects, and maybe even a damaged version of Edward's model. I consider the modelling work to be an integral part of the magic of Thomas, since it's these visuals that truly draw us into the world of Sodor, and believe me, Series 2 does do a good job of that, but I don't think this episode really holds up in that sense. It just feels like missed potential to do something great. Instead of Edward's exploit, I would have included a story that gives Henry something to do, like, I don't know, something in the air. By Series 2, we already know most of the main cast of characters, who had their arcs back in Series 1. The main characters of Series 1, who didn't really have as much to do as the others, were Edward and Percy, and thankfully they have a lot more to do here. But let's talk about the newcomers first. Trevor is a traction engine, who's destined for the scrapyard because he's deemed useless, and he finds a certain kinship in Edward, who is also seen as old and worn out. I think they make a good pair due to the similarities. He also frequently mentions that he likes children. Duck makes a great first impression by working hard and showing the bigger engines that he doesn't take their crap, and he will stand up for himself. I might be wrong on this, but I believe his real life basis is also newer than those of the other engines, which makes his arrival another example of more modern aspects creeping onto the railway. He also just has a really cool design. I think pannier tanks look awesome. Harold is the first and only aerial vehicle of the classic series, and he has a really fun introductory episode with Percy. He has a bit of a stuck-up attitude, thinking railways are out of date and inferior to air travel. And we don't really see much of a follow-up to this. He doesn't speak in the episode after the introduction, so we don't really know if he changed his view or not. I've already spoken a bit about Diesel earlier, but I think he makes a great proper first antagonist for the show, as well as being the first diesel engine. His rivalry with Duck made for quite a compelling three-parter, and like I said before, it was a shame that we never actually got to see his punishment on screen. Donald and Douglas make quite an impactful first impression, by smashing into a signal box, destroying the brake van, and then rescuing Henry from the snow. Their Scottish accents are a joy to listen to, coming from the lips of a narrator trying his best.
Thank you, sir. Does this mean that the both of us...
And I also think the happy faces just look really cute. Bill and Ben, like Donald and Douglas, come off as a pair, and very much work as a pair. They're mischievous little buggers, who are quick to react and tease others, very much like how Thomas was back in Series 1. Boko has a great introduction after a build-up of being some horrible menace in the yard, who magics things away, and then turns out to actually be quite a nice guy. He makes a good counter to Bill and Ben, as a wiser, bigger engine, who doesn't take any of their crap, and he can put them in their place, but is still friends with them. I think it's cool how his real life basis is mentioned in the story. I think this is the only time this ever happens in the classic series as well. Daisy is the show's first female engine, and I think the show honestly went a bit overboard with their presentation. The excessive makeup as well as the seductive sounding music doesn't really sit right with me. It's like,
hello fellow Thomas and Friends character designer. We have our first female character. How do we portray her?
Well, I think we should plaster her face with makeup and give her a musical theme that sounds like she is the star of a 1940s stripper movie.
That is literally the best idea ever. Let's definitely do that.
her faceplate is also just Boko's but with makeup on. Good luck on seeing that. Aside from her design, I think she's fine. I like how she's not really an evil diesel like the last one, she's just lazy. Now it's time to see what the other characters, that we are already familiar with, are up to. In Series 1, Edward's biggest role was in Edward and Gordon, where he got introduced as an older engine who didn't get to go out as much and was laughed at by the others. After that, he was in a few episodes, but usually just as a character who happened to be there at the time when things were happening. After the introductory episode, which is Thomas and Percy story, episodes 2 to 5 are all Edward stories, and later on towards the end he gets Edward's exploit. Here, he has a much better showing as an engine, who is indeed old and worn down, but proves multiple times that he can still do what's needed, helping to save an old traction engine from scrap, catching up to a speeding James to rescue him, and then pushing through bad weather and damage to get passengers home. A great way to portray a great character. Percy goes through a lot. In the very first episode, he crashes through buffers and ends up falling into coal, he has a race with a helicopter, he falls into the harbour, he crashes into trucks and ends up on top of the pile, he crashes into a cart full of lime, and then he ends up covered in treacle and hay. I'm surprised he doesn't need therapy after all of this. Those two definitely get the most, but that's not to say the other characters don't get anything else to do. Thomas spends quite a bit of this series being grumpy and horrible to people. The first time we see him, he's bragging about his blue paint, and how it's the only proper colour for an engine. He has a bit of a spat with Percy, and by the end of the episode they're friends again, but then later on they're back to making fun of each other. He gets really irritable when trains are late due to the viaduct repairs, and he becomes conceited thinking he can drive himself, thanks to an offhanded comment by his crew. Ignoring the obligatory end of series Christmas episode where everybody's happy, the final 2 episodes of Series 2 are just spent with him arguing and making fun of Percy. And these two are meant to be friends, really? Henry just sort of exists this time around. I think the most notable thing that happens to him is either being spooked by a cow or getting rescued from the snow by Donald Douglas. He gets no starring roles. James's entire purpose in Series 2 seems to just be suffering and annoyance. In Old Iron, he's fed up of Edward being old and slow, and then he has a frantic runaway. He gets tricked by Percy and Percying the signal, and then he gets annoyed by Duck in the shed. He gets made fun of by trucks and dirty work, and then in Brake Van, he gets harassed and then caught up in the destruction of the titular Brake Van. Just give the guy a break, seriously. Gordon, like Henry and James, spends a lot of this series as a side character, whose main involvement comes from being part of a group doing stuff. However, he does get a starring role in Wrong Road. Toby gets a bit more to do than the others. He spends a lot of his time with Thomas and Percy, and often joins in with the jokes. He doesn't pick a side, and is happy to join in making fun of either of them, like a true middle friend should. The troublesome trucks get an upgrade here as well. In Series 1, they were a constant source of mishaps for the engines, but not really much beyond that. They didn't have their own dedicated faceplate, just eyes with a barely visible mouth. Now, they do have their own faces, along with way more expressions, which makes them seem more active as the little demons as they are. Not only do they now have faces, but they also start getting more prominent members of their species here, with the inclusion of the spiteful brake van, who plays a major role in an episode. This would later pave the way for more trucks later on, such as SC Ruffy and Toad. Feels like, aside from a few exceptions, everyone is having a miserable time this series. There is definitely an imbalance of character-focused stories here, and whether or not that's an issue is certainly up to opinion. Personally, I believe that an ideal Thomas series would have a fairly balanced amount of episodes that have a starring character, so everyone gets a chance to shine. Series 1 and 2 feel like two halves of one whole, with each having a different set of character episodes. Series 1 has more Thomas, Henry, Gordon and James, while Series 2 has more Percy and Edward. I would have personally got rid of Thomas, Percy and Nicole, the Runaway, and then Edward's exploit. I'd replace them with episodes that give Henry and James more to do, like Buzz Buzz or Tenders for Henry. Series 2 really expands the scope of Sodor. There's a bigger variety of locations on display than what we saw last time. There's a bigger harbour set, a quarry, and a lot more industrial areas, with sheds and yards and mechanical stuff laying about. This is known as the gritty, dirty series, and you can see why. There is still plenty of countryside and rural bits, of course. This set with the rail bridge going over the road beneath looks really cool. The episode Ghost Train shows off a few locations we've already seen before, but at night time and bathed in mist, which looks awesome. I don't think it's as pretty as Series 1 though. Series 1 had a camera that lingered a lot, with many sets looking like illustrations come to life, like a painted world. No, not that one. In comparison, Series 2 seems a lot more normal, realistic, utilitarian. Like it was less focused on displaying this gorgeous place and more just wanting to show you that, yeah, this is the world where this stuff is taking place. There are still nice idyllic shots that I really like, such as the castle and also the cutting that Percy travels down, but it definitely has lost some of that illustrative wonder of Series 1. The camera angles are a lot more dynamic here than they were in Series 1. In the previous series, the camera mostly stayed still to showcase just what was in the frame, and it was slower paced, with the occasional zoom in or out. In Series 2, the camera is flying all over the place. It's panning side to side to show off the bigger sets, it's going down, there's frontal shots with the engines coming towards it, it's hovering over the engine's back ends, it's going over bridges, and we even get an aerial POV from a helicopter. In particular, I really like this long uninterrupted shot going down the platform in Wrong Road, showing all the waiting passengers alongside Gordon and his coaches. There's an awesome variety on display here. The chase scenes and crashes are a lot more dynamic and exciting this time. With a better usage of incidental music and more varied camera angles and movements, they come across as being much more frantic and dangerous. On 2 occasions, an engine crashes into a building, and we even get to see the damage from the inside. Percy getting pushed into the water really benefits from the music switch and the ominous narration. It's great.
I can do that whenever I like. Every wise engine knows that you cannot trust trucks.
Remember how back in Series 1 the water looked like tea? Well, in Series 2 the water looks like tea, but before you add milk to it. Either that or gravy. It makes me both hungry and thirsty. One aspect of Series 2 that definitely leaves a lasting impression, for better or worse, is the faces. Now, the faces of Thomas and Friends have long been a sticking point whenever I've talked about the show with people who weren't really big fans like I am. People who just remember it from their childhoods. Quite a few people said that they found the faces creepy or unsettling. I can see why. I mean, look at this. Series 2 kicks the weirdness factor up a notch, with some oddities staring right at you. First, add the lack of teeth on certain faceplates. It's not all the time, but in some scenes engines just have this gummy grin that makes them look like babies. I don't know if it was a stylistic choice or someone forgot to paint the teeth in, but it's certainly distinctive and it would only be for this series. But then there's the wonky eyes. Series 1 already had this problem in places, but hoo boy, Series 2 made it worse. I think they need to lay off the special coal a bit. Finally, there's this. I don't know why, but Series 2 seems to have a bit of a lack of polish compared to 1 in quite a few places. There's more visible mistakes that stick out like a sore thumb and remain in your memory. Well, they do in mine anyway. Though they are amusing to look at and make fun of, I can't exactly call these things a positive. Ringo Starr's narration seems a lot more enthusiastic this time around. He actually gives Gordon a more consistent lower tone of voice, making him sound a lot deeper than the others. His overall voice is as soothing as ever, making this quite a nice show to fall asleep to. I have listened to George Carlin's narration too, which is good, but honestly, Ringo to me is the definitive voice of Thomas. Not only because it's what I grew up on, but because Thomas is just so quintessentially British that I think he fits better. But ultimately, that's up to the viewer to decide who they prefer. The music, as always, is amazing. The themes from last time make a return, but with updates here and there to spruce them up, along with a whole bunch of new themes. Duck's theme and the Viaduct theme are just so pleasant to listen to, as well as the new takes on the epic Runaway theme. There's none of the more serene, quiet moments that Series 1 had. I do miss those though. Is Series 2 perfect? No, it's not. But then again, what is? I don't think any of my favourite things are perfect. Final Fantasy X isn't perfect, and neither is Batman Begins, both of which I consider to be my favourite entries in their own respective franchises. And neither of them are perfect and have their fair share of flaws. Series 2 was a step forward in the franchise that took what worked in Series 1 and ran with it, expanding on it. It began to creep away from the idyllic illustrated storybook-like time bubble of Series 1, and dragged Sodor more towards the real world, along with the growing pains that come along with it. Its overall similar visual style and shared narrator in Ringo Starr makes Series 2 feel more like a second half of Series 1. A far less substantial leap than the shift from Series 2 to 3, which had an entirely new style that was so drastic it almost feels like a bit of a soft reboot. The modelling work is more ambitious, but still riddled with errors at times. The stories are overall stronger, I think, but not as consistent. Ringo's narration sounds more enthusiastic, and there are a wider variety of characters to showcase the different types of engines you could see on a railway. Is Series 2 still my favourite of the classics? Well, actually now, I think I actually like it a bit less than Series 1. That series had its own unique atmosphere that makes it really stand out, which I covered in more detail in its own video, which I do recommend you go watch after this if you haven't already. Series 2 in comparison feels more regular and grounded, less concerned with making an idealised steam engine heaven, and more of a regular, sometimes dirty and grimy looking working railway. Whichever of these is ideal is ultimately up to your preference, and I believe there's a case to be made for both. Personally, I prefer the former, but I can imagine many preferring the latter. Either way, Series 2 is still great, and it is a shining example of why this show was so good. It's a fantastical world of talking vehicles that tells the stories to both entertain the audience and teach them valuable lessons in a natural, smooth way. The model work is stellar, the music is really good, and the whole thing is generally just a great time throughout, even if there are issues along the way. There's a reason this show captured the hearts of so many of us, and has remained there for all those years since. The classic era of Thomas the Tank Engine and friends may have long since passed, along with quite a few of the creative minds that made it happen, but its legacy will live on, in all of us who still remember and enjoy it, whether it's just quietly watching it and reminiscing, or making content about it like I do. These tracks stretch on into eternity. Thank you for watching, and have a great day.